Well, good afternoon, everyone, and what a pleasure to welcome this group. I'm Arathi Prabhakar. I'm President Biden's Science and Technology Advisor and Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And around this table, and with a few folks on a video link, we have here the U.S. President's Council Advisors on Science and Technology, along with our colleagues from across the way from the UK's Council for Science and Technology. This is a meeting that we've all been looking forward to, and a lot of work has been done to put together a great agenda. And the reason we are here is we all know, first, I think everyone knows that the world is full of hard challenges today. Those of us who have the great privilege of working in science and technology know that the research opportunities ahead are at least as vast as our challenges. But all of that work really is going to require linking hands around the world, and in particular, building this very critical and long-standing partnership between the United States and the United Kingdom. So it's really a pleasure to have this opportunity to build on that. The recent history of the dialogue on science and technology between our two nations includes several steps that led to this meeting. In particular, in June of 2021, the US and the UK put out a joint statement that committed to a close collaboration between these two councils. That was a document that was published alongside the Atlantic Charter, just one part of this broader set of science and technology collaborations aimed at global challenges. The US and the UK reaffirmed that commitment for close collaboration in S&T in a June 2023 Atlantic Declaration for a 21st century US-UK economic partnership. But despite all of those actions, actually the last time these two groups were together was in 2016, and that was in London. And this year we are absolutely delighted that our UK colleagues got on planes and wended their way over here. So we're delighted to have you here in person in Washington. And I think it's a great opportunity to focus on some of the both really breathtakingly difficult challenges that we have, but again, some of the most interesting opportunities for advancement. And that's what we all come to work to do. And so I think we'll have great fun tackling those issues and I think make some headway. I'd like to now turn it over to my co-chairs on PCAST to introduce themselves, and then we'll turn to our CST colleagues.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Frances Arnold, a bio and chemical engineer at the California Institute of Technology.
Hi, and I'm Maria Zuber. I'm a professor of geophysics and the vice president for research at MIT. And I'd now like to turn it over to our UK colleagues, the co-chairs of the UK Council on Science and Technology, John Brown and Angela McLean, and ask them to say a few words.
Thank you. My name is John Brown. I am by profession an engineer, but I'm really a businessman too. And I'm co-chairman with Angela McLean of the Council on Science and Technology. We're delighted to be here. We're confident that every day there are huge collaborations between the United States and the United Kingdom, but these meetings form a very important symbolic moment, as well as a substantive moment, to reinforce the fact that to create solutions to challenges, we have to work even more deeply together. And so we're delighted to be here.
Thank you. And I'm Angela McLean. I'm the Government Chief Scientific Advisor in the UK, which makes me co-chair of CST with John. And as you can hear, I've lost my voice. I think the one thing I would like to say is to thank both PCAST and CST members for being here today with us. And I know many members have put a lot of work in prior to this meeting and preparing materials for us. So thank you.
I think with that, we're ready to turn it over to Steve Pacala of PCAST and Brooke Rogers of CST to launch into the first session.
Good afternoon, everybody. Great to see you all virtually. We live, of course, in dangerous times. Humanity faces a constellation of threats that sadly share their capacity to, with a high degree of certainty, inflict large damages and accelerating damages on us that will begin soon or have already begun. That require global actions to prevent, adapt, and mitigate, and for which the institutions we now have, the global institutions, are almost certainly not completely adequate. This meeting is focused on three of those challenges: the climate problem, emerging pandemics, and emerging antibiotic resistance. And it's focused specifically not just on the problem separately, but on the fact that they interact. And the interactions that we have come to stress through our joint meetings on this aren't the direct ones. You know, the fact that, deforestation leads to zoonotic events that leads to pandemics and also contributes to global warming. But rather the much more difficult to pin down, but potentially more dangerous indirect ones that come through the sort of systemic, system-level feedbacks. An example, for instance, is a heat event in the tropics that kicks off food shortages, leads to conflict, refugees, and conflict, that subsequently is followed by a pandemic, by a zoonotic event and a pandemic, and where the combined stresses overwhelm institutions on a continental scale or even globally. Now, the fact that these system-level interactions are murky and difficult to understand does not make them less dangerous. Quite to the contrary. You can't prepare for what you don't understand. And so here we're going to try to peer into that gloom, and to help us do so, we've assembled a group of four people who are really good at this, who are going to help us with some short talks at the beginning, followed by discussion. So now I want to turn this over to my partner in crime, Brooke Rogers, who's going to introduce the speakers.
Thank you ever so much. I think before I am allowed to introduce the speakers, we need to go over a little bit of housekeeping. So we've asked the panelists to each provide very brief remarks of only 5 to 7 minutes each, and that's to leave enough time for a really exciting and engaging conversation. We look forward to a very animated discussion following their presentations. So during the panel presentations, we ask that all other virtual participants turn off your videos. And once the presentations are concluded, please turn those on again to facilitate and foster discussion. I would also like to remind virtual attendees participating in the discussions that they can use the raise hand function on Zoom if they would like to ask a question. So now I have the honor of introducing our 4 speakers for the session. There is additional biographical information available online on the PCAST website and in the members' agenda books. Our first speaker is Dr. Derek Cummings. He's an infectious disease epidemiologist at the Emerging Pathogens Institute, a research institute affiliated with the University of Florida. His research on emerging pathogens has included studies of MERS, Ebola, and novel influenza, observing and characterizing transmission dynamics in the early days of outbreaks. Particular areas of focus include speed and patterns of transmission and the natural history of a pathogen. So I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Dr. Derek Cummings. Our second speaker, Dr. Judith Green, is a professor of sociology and director of the Wellcome Center for Cultures and Environments of Health at the University of Exeter. She's published on a diverse range of topics in the field of sociology and health medicine, including risk, health services, public understanding of health illness, and research methods. So again, another warm welcome. And our third speaker, Dr. Sarah Kapnick, is Chief Scientist for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Previously, she served as a physical scientist and deputy division leader at NOAA's Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory before becoming chief scientist. Dr. Kapnick worked as a managing director for JP Morgan, providing input as a senior climate strategist, sustainability strategist for asset management, and advisor on new opportunities. And finally, our fourth speaker is Dr. Nick Pidgeon, a professor of environmental psychology and director of the Understanding Risk Research Group within the School of Psychology at Cardiff University. His broad research portfolio concerns empirical studies of risk perception and its communication, upstream public engagement with the environment and new technologies, responsible innovation, and the origins of major technological accidents. So that's the speaking order as well, and we're very, very much looking forward to all of your interesting and insightful contributions today. I'm going to go ahead and lead off the panel and hand over to Derek. As our first speaker, we will need to intervene if we're going over time in order to allow time for discussion. So over to you, Derek, please.
Great. Thank you very much for inviting me here to speak. I'm going to talk about that intersection between emerging pathogens and climate change with a focus, next slide, on dengue, a mosquito-borne pathogen, which I think exemplifies a number of the challenges that we face in responding to human infectious disease threats and pandemics. Certainly, the public health community, one of the next pandemics that we're certainly worried about is another mosquito-borne virus. We've seen pandemics of Zika and chikungunya in the last 10 years sweep the planet. Dengue really sort of advanced to the Western Hemisphere greatly in the 1980s. And so the distribution of this pathogen and our experience in controlling it can really help us understand the challenges in responding to those future pathogens as well. What I'm showing here is a prediction of the global distribution of dengue risk in 2015. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see what it's projected to be in 2080. That map didn't change a ton visually. Certainly in the United States, we have a great advance into the Midwest and up the Atlantic coast. Parts of Southern Europe are now more projected to be more conducive to transmission. But really, the greater impact of climate change, I think, is going to be in the intensification of transmission in those areas where dengue is already present. There's estimated to be 100 million infections of dengue each year. And climate change, particularly changes in temperature and rainfall, changes how effectively the virus transmits between mosquitoes and humans. Next slide. Right now, we're seeing an example of that intensification due to enhanced climate variability. We're in the middle of an El Nino event, and we're seeing record numbers of dengue cases in Brazil and many parts of South America. These are cases from last week. The dark blue are this year's compared to the years previous. And dengue has an amazing potential to have huge swings in the number of cases from season to season. In places where dengue transmits, cases can be 30 times as great from one year to the next. And what this does is create incredible stresses on health systems where facilities are set up to provide care for dengue patients. Wards that are meant to treat other diseases are transferred to treat dengue cases, and so it has a broad impact on health systems beyond just those dengue cases, but on other symptoms, other diseases as well. Next slide. And we've seen this intensification associated with El Nino events where certain regions of the globe have increased temperatures, changes in precipitation. Before, in the late 90s, across the region I'm showing here in the upper right, in Southeast Asia, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and a number of other countries. If you look on the upper left, you can see each row is a time series where high incidence is indicated in red, low incidence is indicated in blue. And you can see sort of vertical bands, two vertical bands of red, indicating widespread outbreaks across the region of dengue. And this occurred during an El Nino event that was associated with increased temperatures on the bottom left. You can see that sort of band in red in 1998. really led to sort of an increase in temperatures across the region, and basically led to 2 dengue seasons right next to each other. And so this sort of, much as we've seen in hurricanes in the United States and other areas, where the warming of the oceans leads to sort of increased energy and increased frequency and intensity of hurricanes, sort of analogous in this system, that increased temperature has led to sort of an intensification of outbreaks with bigger swings from year to year, and those sort of hugely societally disruptive outbreaks occurring in a synchronized fashion across a large region. Next slide. I think these outbreaks really present an opportunity for us to prepare for pandemics of newly emerged pathogens, and really sort of building expertise as well as testing our strategies and systems. I think often there's sort of 2 buckets of thinking of routine public health response and then pandemic response. And I think we really need to start treating these sort of, particularly these large outbreaks of endemic pathogens, as test beds to really to build our competencies and strategies to respond to pandemics. I also think it's a clear opportunity to build trust, which is a huge we've seen as a huge barrier to responding effectively to pandemics, certainly in the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. Next slide. Dengue, as well as many other mosquito-borne pathogens and pathogens broadly, disproportionately affect people with low resources. This is a community that I work in Salvador, Brazil, that was heavily affected by the Zika pandemic. And really engaging these communities in control is needed to really sort of have that trust and capacity to respond when these large outbreaks or novel pandemics occur, in order to ramp up that response by demonstrating responses sort of year in and year out that is useful. Certainly, we see that cycle that Stephen mentioned, that because these populations are disproportionately affected by infectious diseases, they become more marginalized. Those sort of informal communities built up in settlements on the fringes of cities provide sort of a foci for infectious diseases that have increased transmission intensity, and that sort of cycle continues. Next slide. The Zika pandemic really laid bare one thing that I think is a blind spot in our pandemic response. And that is the ability to sort of detect the burden of these pathogens. I'm showing here a child who has microcephaly, a congenital syndrome, which is associated with a woman being infected in the first or second trimester of their pregnancy. And the Zika pandemic really occurred with very little note of the widespread transmission in Brazil and a number of other countries in South America, until these cases of microcephaly started showing up 7 to 9 months after the big outbreaks. And so in Brazil, you can see that 70% of the population in Salvador was infected in a 5-month period. But these cases, because they weren't likely to be symptomatic, or they were mildly symptomatic, that sort of huge outbreak of Zika infection wasn't really noted, or really wasn't understood to be as extensive as it was, until this other burden arose of children with microcephaly. I'm showing here immune responses in a serological cohort that I work with that is ongoing, where you could go back and reconstruct that, there was this really huge outbreak, one of the largest in sort of intensity and sort of space and time in recent human history. But you can only sort of reconstruct that because you had a serological cohort. And so it's striking here that we can have pandemics that will have downstream effects potentially, But in many areas of the globe, we're really not set up to detect them and to characterize them with ongoing resources. Next slide.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Derek. I'm sure that we can dig into this in much, much more detail during the discussion. But in the interest of time, I'm going to have to move us over to Judith for her presentation. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Judith Green from the University of Exeter and delighted to be here. So I'm also going to focus on pandemics and one of the major challenges in terms of planning for pandemics, which is balancing what you could call an international global coordinated response with tweaking that to get the right knowledge in the right place at the right time for adapting appropriate national responses. And I'm going to focus particularly on one kind of evidence that I think is typically there, but not necessarily mobilized or maybe invisible to those doing planning. And that is knowledge that is about and from publics. So I refer to publics in the plural, partly to flag the diversity of publics that are relevant in ensuring that our systems are robust in the face of uncertainty, but also to highlight the idea that the public isn't just an aggregation of the individuals in a particular national population. It's actually a level that's as complex as any other part of that system. And one thing I do want to flag today, perhaps, is the need for more sophisticated ways of thinking about those publics in relation to global health challenges, and better ways of utilising knowledge both from and about those publics in pandemic planning. And perhaps not surprisingly, given my disciplinary background, I want to suggest the better utilisation of social science knowledge in that. So next slide, please. If I could start with a brief example from sort of fairly recent history, and this was the threat in 2004 of an emerging avian influenza pandemic, when the World Health Organization called for an international response that basically contained the disease at source in Southeast Asia, managed the threat in countries that were identified at risk, and a response that arguably perhaps was primarily oriented to protecting the global north. I'm drawing here on Kennedy Mwakalimba's work on how pandemic preparedness played out in one of those at-risk countries, and that was Zambia. Now, Mwakalimba argued that donor aid to support Zambia's pandemic response insufficiently considered that national context of human and animal health. And that international programs that were largely aimed at containment through measures such as trade bans or improved biosecurity were therefore not always appropriate. And he looks in detail at Zambia as a case study and documents some of the knowledges that he's saying were sort of insufficiently mobilized. They were there, but insufficiently mobilized in order to make an appropriate pandemic response. So, for instance, it was small-scale and backyard poultry producers who were identified as the major biosecurity risk, yet Mwakalimba argues that poultry production in Southeast Asia is quite different to that in Zambia, where backyard farmers are far less likely to be entangled in the larger wet markets and mixed farming systems that were typical of Southeast Asia. Second, international planning didn't take sufficient account of Zambia's own trade and development needs. Zambia was a country with existing in the here and now epidemics of HIV and tuberculosis, and a strategic need to invest in a far more important in development terms cattle market rather than poultry production. So things that were higher priorities in terms of livelihoods and health than any kind of threatened epidemic that might come in the future. So there's a real difficulty in kind of protecting in at-risk countries where that's not aligned to immediate priorities for livelihood. And third, at the national level, gaps in knowledge transfer between ministries that led to trade bans that were extremely hard to enforce in what's a landlocked country with 8 very porous borders and very limited veterinary expertise to manage livestock movements across them. So I don't use this example as one of policy failure. It wasn't necessarily policy failure, but rather as what I think was a very nice example of the importance and the difficulty of making an international coordinated response that at a national level really pulls in the right kind of knowledge in the right places to craft the sorts of responses that are the most effective. So all that knowledge existed. National trade and development experts knew about the export needs and so on. Small-scale poultry farmers know how they interact with markets and how they trade and manage their livestock. And the vets in the country know about their limited capacity, but somehow that's the kind of knowledge that doesn't necessarily either isn't known or isn't mobilised in quite the right places at the right times in order to craft appropriate responses. Now, obviously, with the advantage of hindsight, it's relatively easy to spot the actors that you need and the kinds of knowledge that you need in order to do that. What's a bit harder is to think ahead and think about emerging pandemics and what kinds of, how we can maximise the system's ability to mobilise the right kind of knowledge at the right time and the right place. One common thread, I will suggest, in those retrospective analyses that's often missing is knowledge both from publics, so people like livestock farmers and how they operate, but also knowledge what I would describe as about publics, so not just individuals and how they act, but how those publics of various kinds operate in a complex way as a system. Next slide, please. So if I move to our more recent experiences with the COVID pandemic, perhaps I can just show how that knowledge from and about publics was we would argue, systematically sidelined in some of the pandemic responses. And this comes from a review I did with some US colleagues, just looking at how the public in broad terms were positioned in some of the public health messaging. So a first kind of factor was that the public were typically positioned as sort of empty vessels, people who knew nothing that were there to wait to be filled by expert guidance. A second, I think perhaps surprising, at least for the anthropologists and sociologists involved in the review finding, was that publics across many countries in Europe and the Americas were positioned largely as national publics. Here was a global threat, and yet the rhetoric was not just national, but at times nationalistic about defending the population of a country. And that perhaps raises some issues around how we do position pandemic preparedness in terms of this kind of crafting national responses. Third, when not passive, publics were largely positioned as ignorant or even resistant, for instance, likely to be led astray by fake news on social media and in need of strong, clear, unambiguous messages, because anything that admitted uncertainty would get misconstrued. Now, if those were the dominant framings in some of the public health messaging and policy and politics rhetoric, there were, of course, other publics and public knowledges that were very evident in other domains. So, and these were often documented in social science and humanities research. So, in the face of rapidly evolving and uncertain scientific knowledge, the public in the UK, at least, were engaged in an adaptive process of working out how to live with a virus that wasn't known by experts nor publics. They were sharing knowledge with each other on how to manage infection risks from shopping coming into the house or post arriving. They were sharing practical skills in how to make a homemade mask. And they were also developing resilience through active community organising self-help groups and shopping runs for vulnerable neighbours and so on. Now, this knowledge, again, was known. It's not that nobody knew this was happening. There were some fairly rapid social science and humanities studies that were funded during the pandemic to map and document some of these effects. But somehow, sorry, next slide, please. Somehow those kinds of knowledges, often mobilised in real time, were not necessarily sufficiently integrated in planning.
I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to, we'll have to dig into these in the discussion. I'm going to have to move us on to the next speaker. And I'm so sorry to interrupt, Judith, but in the interest of time, I must move us on to Sarah as well. And the slides will be available and we can certainly dig in during the discussion. Thank you ever so much, Judith.
Thank you. Next slide. First slide I want to show is the map of extremes that take place around the world in 2023. We put out a report every single month of where these events are taking place. Climate change is increasing the frequency and intensity of many of these events. For example, more intense heat waves, coastal flooding, rainfall events, severe drought, and heightened wildfire risks. These are all changing, and we can connect all of them to increases in atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. Next slide. But these events, when we're used to looking at them and thinking about them in the past, we isolate them by event. And in fact, we are now seeing compound risks. So these risks are more than a sum of their parts. I've pulled these figures from the National Climate Assessment from the United States. The fifth one just came out, and it shows the compound events of just 2020 and 2021. On the picture on the right, you can see the timing of heat, drought, and fire events across the United States West, while on the East Coast faced destructive numerous tropical cyclones. All of this is also superimposed on top of COVID, which depicted modestly at the bottom of the image. If we think of these events individually, they're not actually independent. There can be a higher likelihood for them to occur at the same time or in sequence. And the statistics of their occurrences are also changing, compounding their impact on a society that was built for a climate that no longer exists. We're finding that people are also having a really hard time conceptualizing what it looks like to have compound events. And so artwork is increasingly being used on the left-hand side, thinking about floods and a heat wave at the same time, and with the interactions with both the natural environment as well as the built environment. Next slide. While extreme weather and climate events often attract most of our attention, there are also relatively slower environmental shifts that we're seeing associated with climate change that also present us with important risks. On this slide, I've given two examples. One on the left is how valley fever is expanding across the United States. Right now, it's a very small range in instances in the American Southwest, but by the end of the century, we see it crossing potentially all the way from the South, all the way up to the Canadian border. This happens when climate warms and soils dry out in much of the West, and this fungus that causes it will be viable in many places farther north that have never experienced this disease. On the right-hand side, I'm also showing an image of the ocean. So thinking about how climate change affects the biogeochemical cycles in the ocean and associated particularly with plankton, you'll notice the areas with several processes indicating the direction of net changes, and it's unclear if it's going up or if it's going down. Given that over 70% of the Earth is covered by oceans, that plankton represent billions of tons of biomass and are the important source of our oxygen that we breathe on land, all these changes are important to our marine food web and the chemistry of the planet and have all these downstream impacts. In both cases, our ability to characterize and hopefully manage these risks is predicated on the robustness of our monitoring systems. If we can't observe and track these changes, we could be flying blind. We also need models to put the information together to understand what is happening both between the observation points and the gaps that we have, but also to forecast, predict, and project these changes over the coming hours to decades. Next slide. But there's some good news. Our projections of future climate conditions improved dramatically in the last decades. Our understanding of the system and how it is responding is improving, and our uncertainty ranges are all coming down. And even in simulations where we have uncertainty, where it can be substantial, like ice sheets and how they respond to global warming, we've developed scenarios that can assist us in planning for the future. So examples of this, on the left-hand side, we have how high tide and sea level rise is changing. On the right-hand side, we now have websites where people can access the information to understand what the future holds. Next slide. I want to pivot to talking what's holding us back. And we have three major challenges. One, although we have an abundance of information about the future climate, we've struggled to infuse this information to many local scale decisions that affect land use, infrastructure, housing, public health, and natural resources. We need community scale engagement to assist planners and community leaders to identify where the great climate information can be taken and link up with all the decisions that they need. We've been involved in a lot of this work. We've been working in US Virgin Islands for hurricane preparedness, in Phoenix on extreme heat, and on Honolulu, Hawaii, to think about resilience plans for the cities. But we need to scale this up across all of our countries. Next slide. A second challenge is we have a limited understanding of the economic exposure and vulnerability. Shown here are a number of the reports from government agencies for the last few years, as well as an article about the National Academy's Roundtable, actively focused on translating physical climate risk into economic terms. While we can usually demonstrate that the impacts of climate change are costly, and most of the studies are one-off looking at individual parts of the economy, there are many gaps in how this is articulated. For example, how do these impacts affect federal spending over a 10-year budgetary window? How do the impacts ripple through labor markets, insurance markets, and the credit markets? How will industries reallocate their resources or change their priorities or change regions in which they operate following extreme events or in anticipation of climate change? Next slide. The third challenge I wanted to mention is that inequities in our society are very much at play when it comes to individual and groups that are most exposed and vulnerable to climate impacts. Here I'm showing relationships as an example between average temperature and incomes in Atlanta, Houston, and Minneapolis. In these cities, as in many cities across the US and across the world, those with the lowest incomes are more likely to live in the warmest parts of the city and have less shade and vegetation to offset extremes. We're doing a bunch of mapping programs where we're showing this and then working with community managers to reduce these impacts, but it's one example of many where we need to understand where the vulnerabilities are, where climate change is happening, and then how to respond to reduce that vulnerability. Next slide. With my final slide, I also want to raise the question, are we doing enough? Are we directing our resources appropriately? This shows the estimates of global levels of finance directed towards climate solutions, both public and private sources. Until recently, only less than 5%, now it's about 5 to 10% of total global finance is actually going towards adaptation. And you can see this imbalance in this slide. Mitigation is no doubt really important for addressing long-term climate change, but at the risk of oversimplifying, I'd also argue that we need to start managing adaptation. The extremes that we're seeing, they're in the here and now. We're seeing the impacts financially on society, and we need to be able to start including adaptation into more of our thinking and more of our finance. Adaptation requires a multi-scale approach. It's heavily weighted towards local scales. It involves an economic equation that many terms are not well known. The research of that is ongoing. And it forces us to confront deep societal inequities. So it brings together all of us on this panel of how we think about this problem. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much. That was an amazing sprint. So thank you ever so much. And I suspect that Nick has been frantically cutting slides behind the scenes. So I'm going to hand over to Nick for our final presentation before we open this up for discussion.
Yes, thank you very much, Brooke. Yeah, I wanted to make 4 points to contribute to our discussion today. First on complexity, second on perceptions, third on control under uncertainty, and then a final question we might consider about globalization and learning. Next slide, please. So in thinking about the interactions between the different risks that we face today, we should not lose sight of their commonalities. It's often easy to be a chemical engineer, an environmental scientist, or an epidemiologist without considering what can be learned from other domains. So I want to step away just briefly in this talk from our core cases, we'll come back to them later, obviously, to consider what we know from some other areas. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, one such commonality is the human element. We know a lot about that now. When things do go badly wrong, several causes, environmental, technical, but crucially also organizational and human factors often contribute in very complex interactions, what the International Risk Governance Council now calls systemic risk. These background factors incubate over time, and generally there were warnings. So somebody somewhere knew something critical. So this example of the Challenger space shuttle has been closely analyzed. While it was low temperatures at launch and a faulty rocket design, which led to a leak of hot gases breaching the fuel tank, the real causes were production pressures, failure to understand the risk over time, and a poor safety culture at NASA. Risk is not simply environmental or technical. Next slide, please. How people perceive risk, which we've studied a lot in our research group in the world, matters too. As Judith has said, there are multiple publics out there, something the pandemic taught us. People use a range of factors to appraise risk issues as well. Risk and benefit judgments, yes, but also trust in others, equity issues, and the values and narratives of everyday life that we live our lives by. Also, our appraisals of risk may change, something called risk amplification, or be suddenly absent, something called risk attenuation. And those perceptions can have very real consequences. Next slide. So just a very brief example of how perception dynamics can change the conversation within society and risk regulation. In autumn 2013, a little herd of tree disease, Cholera fraxinaria, way down on the UK's biosecurity risk register, about 135 or something, I think, suddenly had the Environment Minister asking why they were reading in the press that our ash trees were about to be decimated by a fearsome new pathogen. Of course, it was a serious issue, although not quite as serious as The Guardian and other media outlets were making at the time. A task force duly reported back on tighter controls. But as part of that effort, I and colleagues looked at why the public controversy had broken out literally within a month from nothing to this big national controversy. And here it was clear a threat to a key symbol, the tree of British landscape and identity, combined with a lurking invisible killer over which we had little control, had fueled the flames of the controversy. Next slide, please. Moving back to the safety domain, this is some fairly old work, but it's still relevant today. Many risks, whether biosecurity, climate change, or industrial hazards, have layers of uncertainty attached to them. This is actually Dungeness B Power Station, widely regarded as one of the biggest failures of UK post-war energy planning. It did not have any form of major accident, fortunately, but was way over budget and delivery time. As a result of this example and others, the sociologist David Collingridge posed his dilemma of control. Next slide, please. Put simply, early on, when one can steer a project or risk issue, there may be too much uncertainty and ignorance, the unknown unknowns as we now think of them, to know what options to take. Later, when the fog of uncertainty clears, it may be difficult to change course because of project and technology momentum and lock-in. Hence, deep uncertainty needs strategies of flexibility, monitoring, openness to change, and correction as a project or issue develops, what IRGC would call resilience through adaptability. Next slide, please. This is my final example, and this slide is quite a difficult one to view, and it's on the point of learning. These are not easy images, but they remind us that risks can have very tragic consequences in the real world. In 1974, I think, a building on the Isle of Man, 73, burnt to the ground. It had been constructed of plastic flammable panels, where a small fire started by vandals outside had spread quickly. Over 50 died, mostly in families. Of course, fast forward 54 years and a technology, cladding panels to improve energy efficiency to help with climate change, also caught fire with the loss of some 80 lives in London. Next slide, please. Now, it's not our job here to preempt the outcome of the Grenfell inquiry, but questions are now being asked about how events which we thought we had learned from are now reoccurring. The Grenfell fire and Summerland are not the only example. One of my colleagues at the COS has argued that there are actually facets of globalization, and which we know have generated great economic wealth and social benefit around the world. They may also be making hazards recur in ways that happened in the past. Digitalization, externalization of responsibility and safety, modes of financialization that are new and not transparent, standardization and self-regulation. He argues all have implications for how we govern risks across the board for all hazards. Next slide and final slide. So I'd just like to say thank you very much for listening. I look forward to the conversation we're about to have. And thank you also to the three funder centres which support the work in our group. Thank you, Brooke.
Thank you ever so much. I feel like I should gift back some of that time to the previous speakers as well. So thank you for keeping to time and for sharing your views on this. We're now going to open this up to about 40 minutes for discussion. So if there's anything, I know you had so many ideas coming into this. If there's anything that you didn't have time to share, you can flesh that out. You can expand upon that in the discussion. For our virtual attendees, if you want to participate in the discussion, please remember to raise your hand so that we can see you. And for the rest of us, I believe that we put our name tags on the side in order to do that. I'm not quite sure about the angle or my eyesight on some of these name tags here, so I might need a little help from across the room if we get over there. Steve, I'm sensitive to the fact that you are also sitting virtually and participating virtually. So I thought it would be wonderful to actually pass the first question to you.
Sure. Thank you, Brooke. And I want to thank all the speakers for provocative statements. I've written down questions for each of you, but because it's fresh in our minds, Nick, your admonition that came from a colleague that because of deep uncertainty, you've got to build adaptability in from the beginning, because otherwise lock-in eventually comes back to harm you, or at least the risk is that it's there, is one that I'm sure resonated with everyone who's certainly with all the with any academic, right? You have to onboard new information and have the ability to do so. With problems that are global, all right, in nature, how does one build adaptability into global institutions that are required to manage global threats? Global institutions, as we know, are tugged from many different directions simultaneously. So are there any precedents for adaptable global institutions that we should look to as guides?
Thank you. Yes. I mean, I think it's hard to answer that in relation to global institutions, but there are certainly precedents of very large, complex institutions that have tried to grapple with this problem. And in fact, the early work in the 80s on the accident chains and the social and organizational preconditions was then followed in the States, in the US, by something called the High Reliability Organizations Program, which looked at very large systems such as aircraft carriers, air traffic control. And in Europe, we tried to think through what the dimensions of something called safety culture, good safety culture, would be. Where you end up, I think, is you have to have very good, two things. You have to have very good monitoring systems within the organization, and you have to then have a certain internal flexibility, which overrides the standard controls and systems of operation when somebody spots something that they think is an incubating hazard. So in the case of the high reliability organizations and the aircraft carriers, which are obviously the US military, and they have very hierarchical organization normally. However, there was a norm in place, which the sociologists found when they went and looked, which meant that any junior rating could stop operations straight away if they saw there was something really nasty on the flight deck. So, and that was part of their operating culture, and that was why they were a high reliability organization. So I think some of that thinking can be put into larger global institutions as well. So it's both flexibility and also good surveillance. Thank you.
Steve, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Actually, Nick, you mentioned three things. The first thing you mentioned, though, was that you need good observations. You need ongoing surveillance, right, and information. And I thought you were going there initially, and I'm curious why you didn't. So one thing that we might agree on is the need for better observing systems, and which is, of course, a precondition for being able to be adaptive in time.
Yeah, of course. And again, coming back, again, this is again a technical domain, but in aviation, it's been learned. It was learned very early that you had to collect incident reports and you had to try and understand what the incident reports meant. And for every 99 you collected, 98 didn't tell you much. And then the issue for the safety analysts is to work out which one really tells you something useful. And that's there's been a lot of thinking about collective mindfulness and how organizations work through a problem and try and dig into the uncertainty as you're getting weak signals of potential failure coming along the line.
And Brooke, back over to you, because I can't see any of the hands in the room. All right.
Thank you so much. I was just going to pause for a moment and see whether or not Judith, Sarah, or Derek wanted to come in response to your first question. And I think that I see Sarah nodding, but you might be nodding yourself into an answer you don't want to give. So Sarah.
I wanted to say from our perspective of NOAA, where we have the National Weather Service and we're dealing with issues, but also we have the research and information long term. When we think about disasters times, you have before a disaster where you can do pre-planning and understanding your exposures, and then you have your event plan, you reduce those exposures, but then you also have event planning for how you deal with an event as it unfolds. And then during the event, you have your planning where you execute that. So you've already had that pre-plan, you execute it, but you can only do that if you also have an early warning system. So the observations are critical for that early warning to know when something's starting to unfold, because there's certain mitigating factors that you can do when you start to put those plans in place once you know. And then once you're really in it, you're just dealing with the event. And then after a disaster, there's also heightened awareness, and everyone has heightened awareness that this event has taken place. With extreme weather and climate events, what we see at that point too is people are asking the question, what is the likelihood of this event? What is the likelihood of recurrence? Is that event changing over time? And that is the critical stage also for giving the information about how to plan to reduce that vulnerability. So that thing that people have experienced, the loss of life, loss of death, livelihoods, economic, that you can then build that resilience for a much longer period. And so we also see it with these 3 different phases of critical work that you need to do, and you need to do them across all of them. And it requires the observations, but also the modeling of what the forward looks like.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I'm often concerned about all of us actually being exhausted by the time we get to collecting evidence around recovery, and also our focus on direct impacts versus secondary stressors. So, just in terms of things that keep me up at night, I'd like to see greater pushing on that front if we can do that collectively across the room. I see 2 more hands online, and after that, I'm going to open it up to the main room. So I'd like to welcome Max Liu, who has joined us online from CST as well. But Max, before I come to you, I'm going to go to Derek as one of our panelists who was contributing, and then over to you, Max. Derek, please.
Yes, I was just going to weigh in that I think in the pandemic space, because of the urgency of response, there's often a devaluation of flexible surveillance that's not targeted towards creating a specific intervention that could be implemented in the short term. And I think in the COVID pandemic, we saw this, that in order to create that adaptability that Stephen mentioned, you need resources that are generally observing what's happening and can be responsive, right, to collect information that you might not have known you needed or would be critical. And I think different countries put different weights on this. The UK definitely invested heavily in generalizable surveillance that I think we really need to build. There's been calls, my last slide, I wanted to mention sort of, calls for a global serum observatory where we can have generalizable sort of analytical, logistical frameworks to observe not just pre-pandemic, during pandemics, and post, sort of what's going on in populations to make those adaptable, sort of flexible decisions.
Thank you ever so much, Derek. And I'm going to move over to Max, and then again, I'll open up to the main room after that. Max, please.
Thank you very much, Brooke. I'd just like to say a fascinating presentation. It's very insightful. My question is that given the interconnectedness of these global challenges, as Steve also mentioned, I think the global issues such as climate change, biodiversity, or the pandemic all require global solutions. Therefore, collaboration is key. How can we develop a comprehensive systems-based kind of a strategy that would actually coordinate and also develop the adaptation and the mitigation strategies? And what international mechanism is most effective?
Okay, thank you ever so much, Max. And the quality was a little bit poor this, and so I don't know if you can check your microphone setting a little bit, please, so that we don't miss out. But thank you so much, Max. Okay, I'm going to open this up to the main room. We've got name tags sticking up. I've been getting a little bit of assistance along the way here. So I'm going to move over to Eric Horowitz, please, as our first question from the room.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentations. I want to head back to uncertainty. Uncertainty was clearly a theme through all the presentations. Some folks addressed it more explicitly than others. For example, there was very little uncertainty in the map of going from 2020 to 2090 for a particular infectious disease. My comment is, are we able in our communications and our analyses to propagate, to compute qualitatively or quantitatively and propagate measures of uncertainties that would also carry into visualizations, so we don't look at specific point estimates? And secondly, if we have models, qualitative or quantitative, of the uncertainty, we can turn that around and really ask the question with investment of time and effort, what are ideal sensing strategies? What is the expected value of information of collecting new data over time or now that we don't have? And so it's more of the notion of how much deeper can we go with the quantification and the leveraging of models of uncertainty, even for the qualitative side of things.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to pass that back to our panel for any responses or reflections to Eric's question.
Yeah, certainly. I think you're referring to the maps that I displayed. I certainly
not just yours.
Yeah,
all four speakers to some extent.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree that particularly spatial information, there is a huge need to quantify and communicate uncertainty, and I think not just for infectious diseases and sort of and their dynamics. I think there has to be sort of a greater sort of recognition of a potential misunderstanding of the system in general, right? So rather than parametric uncertainty and sort of building models and sort of this is the range of what they can say, really trying to build out sort of those key structural uncertainties in our understanding, and identifying those that contribute the most to our estimates. And it's not just sort of measurement, but also sort of it can provide, as you say, expected value information and understanding certain scientific realms that touch a particular problem.
Thank you ever so much. And I see that Judith and Sarah have their hands up online as well. So Judith, would you like to come in, please? Oh, Judith, I'm so sorry. You're on mute.
I had to do that. Sorry, someone had to do it. It was a very brief point, which is just that I think one of the things we're not very good at in general is communicating that kind of uncertainty to the public. There's often a kind of assumption that if you communicate the messiness of science or the messiness of our surveillance systems, that we know there's going to be an emerging pandemic. We just don't know where it'll be, how deadly it'll be, whether our current vaccines are going to work or not. But communicating that kind of uncertainty feels high risk. And I just think we probably need better ways of doing that, because overstating the certainty of science tends to have really dysfunctional outcomes. And we certainly have seen that in the UK with perhaps overstating some of the MMR certainty ends up denting trust a little bit. And we just need better ways of thinking about how we do communicate those inevitable uncertainties, because there will be a limit to how far they can be reduced, however sophisticated the quantitative modelling gets.
Thank you so much. It's a really important point, and both an art and a science, I think, on that communication of uncertainty front. Thank you, Judith. So I'm going to move over to Sarah, please.
Yes, thank you. I would say with climate change itself, on biological, chemical, physical aspects of climate change, there's also been an evolution of the field itself towards being able to characterize uncertainty better. And part of that has been the change in models in high performance computing that allows us to make really large ensembles to be able to give probabilistic estimates of the future in the way that we historically have for weather forecasting. And so it's really starting to change the field over the last 5 to 10 years that we can do this. When you go into impacts that then relate to society, the uncertainty becomes harder because now you're overlaying some of that information from the biological, physical, chemical into the social sides. And I agree wholeheartedly that the need to communicate how we think about those uncertainties and how we quantify it is very important, and where in the process, particularly when you're creating these impact analysis, where in the process the uncertainty is introduced is a really important thing that needs to be communicated. And increasingly at our agency in viewing this, we've also been hiring up behavioral economists or behavioral scientists, social scientists to be able to help us with the communication and also with how we fund things. An example that's really well known is that on tornadoes, for example, there was a debate of investing more in being able to extend tornado forecasting out to half an hour, or should we spend more money on making sure that the forecasts that we have, that people are accessing them? Which one would reduce deaths? And we found in that research that actually making sure that everyone had access to the information, like the really good science that exists, making sure that people had access to that information reduced deaths more than extending the time, because extending the time actually led people to getting into their cars and trying to drive away from storms, which could put them in harm's way. And so the very study of how the science then is used and valued and actually leads to outcomes is just as important as some of the science around what happens in the future to make sure that we have the societal outcome that we want.
Thank you ever so much. And I'm going to hand over to Nick, and then we'll go back out to questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Just briefly on the uncertainty communication. I mean, there is a lot of work on risk communication, and I think the answer to this question depends upon what uncertainty we're talking about. So if you've got reasonably well-structured risk issues, then we know what to avoid. Let's put it no more than that in presenting risks to people. The more ill-structured the problem becomes and the deeper the uncertainties become, you're closer to having more of a two-way conversation with people. That actually, it's not a question of presenting the pure science. It's a question of trying to understand how what you know plays into people's pre-existing knowledges on the ground. It's important, though, to say, if there are things people can do to protect themselves under uncertainty, what are those? And what are we doing in the institutions and elsewhere to deal with the risk as well? So that's such an important part of the communication, aside from the basic probability and consequence. Thank you.
It certainly is. And you can see it's a concern really across the challenge spaces. So listening to you, Nick, as well, there's a lot of evidence and literature that can come in to shape our understanding of how to communicate uncertainty in this space. So finding ways to pull that into the system will be very, very important. So I'm going to move over to Angela McLean for our next question. Keep putting your signs up. I might start doing cluster questions along the way if we are getting short on time. And you know what I'm like about time already, don't you? So Angela, please.
So I'm acting as Angela's voice. And so Angela's question is to Sarah. You asked if we are spending our climate change funds correctly. Do you have a method to address that question? Can I add a rider, in particular between the North and South?
Angela, did you give him permission to add that? Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Okay.
This is a deep open question. The reason I brought it up is that there's being a shift towards realizing that we need to spend more towards adaptation. The early research that I see cited absolutely everywhere is that $1 towards resilience and adaptation leads to $6 in outcomes that we've seen in the United States when we've done adaptation work. The trouble of it too is that the amount of mitigation that we spend affects how much adaptation is required, because the amount of mitigation that takes place changes which trajectory we are on for climate. And so the numbers that I've seen, getting to net zero by 2050 requires $4 to $5 trillion of spending a year. The adaptation numbers have been on the order of 1 to 2, depending on what pathways you're on. And then if there is less done on mitigation, you have to spend more on adaptation, or it leads to people leaving certain regions. And so the science of that actually is a very important active area to better understand how much needs to be spent on adaptation, but even what are the impacts of resilience measures on society, on communities? What are the economic impacts besides just the biological, chemical, physical, to be able to also inform how we make those decisions for efficient investment. And I would say that area of science is very, very new.
Thank you ever so much. And just looking across the panelists, if anyone wants to come in before I swing out for another question. Steve, are you okay? Because a lot of questions are in the room right now. Okay, jump in if you need to. So I'm going to move over to Terry Tao, please.
Hi, thank you. This is, I guess, for the whole panel. So my question is about the trade-off between the speed of pandemic response and the quality of pandemic response. If you respond too hastily, you may make policy decisions that will reverse later. And if you wait too long, then it may be too late to contain the pandemic. So like, how do you decide what to prioritize? Or should we be thinking about sort of measures that can do both at the same time, like pre-planning and war gaming and practice drills and so forth?
Thank you ever so much. So I'll hand that over to the panel. Any reflections, suggestions, ideas about how to go about this? Okay. No takers. Derek, thank you.
Yeah, so I think this is inherently tied up with your treatment and communication of uncertainty. I think those fast responses often run afoul when they're changed later, when you haven't communicated sort of what information, what was used to sort of to make those decisions, and really sort of communicated that there may be changes when you make a decision under high uncertainty. So I think improving communication can help you mitigate the risk of sort of making quick decisions that need to respond to the time scale of, let's say, the rapidity of spread of a pandemic, but need to do so without the benefit of great information.
Thank you, Judith. I see your hand up.
It's a methods point, really, which is that it's really difficult to know because you've never got the counterfactual of if you didn't put the pandemic response in place, what would have happened had you not done it. So if you're really successful, it looks like you've wasted a whole lot of money because avian influenza didn't hit Zambia. Whereas if you didn't put the pounds or the dollars in, it would look like you were careless and you should have done X, Y, Z. So it's a methodological point rather than a substantive point, but one of the things that would be useful is better methods for kind of looking at the sorts of planning and the kinds of spending that were done in terms of the outcomes that were a way of kind of planning that, but which is not an answer to the question. It's just a reflection that given we never have the alternative history of what would have happened had we not done X, Y, Z, it is quite hard to know that.
Thank you ever so much. So I'm going to move into clusters. We've got 2 clusters of questions that we'll then send out to the panelists. So we'll do one cluster panelists, another cluster panelists, and then I'm going to have a final question from our fearless leader across the way to wrap us up. So the first cluster of questions come from Kathy Sullivan and Ottiline Lizer, please. Kathy.
Thank you very much. This is much amusing, so very much helpful. It's going into cluster. I want to pick up what Nick said about the United States Navy and how the way an aircraft carrier operates somehow manages to rise above what you might otherwise expect the risk level to be in such a complex operation. True disclosure, I was in the United States Navy and served on carriers now and then. That really rests on a culture, a very carefully inculcated culture of situational awareness. So you have just one organization. It's relatively simple for everyone to understand from the admiral to the rating. You're the local expert. It's your deck. If you call it, it happens. We see similar things in NASA mission control. my question that I've been musing on since you tabled that, Nick, is how far, to what degree, by what methods could we bring that kind of operational culture into the more complex sociopolitical structures and communities that really are planning for, driving, affecting, responding to these disasters?
Thank you so much, Kathy. And Ottoline, please.
Yes, so my question or comment is really at the other end almost of the process. What is the role of really clearly defining the outcomes that your response is aiming to achieve? Because it might be different in different parts of the world. And certainly a challenge, I think, that was very clear in the UK response to pandemic is tensions between alternative outcomes. Are you worrying about immediate loss of life, longer term loss of life, or damage to the economy and the consequences of that on the quality of people's lives? So how do we tune our responses very clearly and explicitly towards particular outcomes that we are able clearly to express and get buy-in to, or indeed input into from the publics that we are trying to serve?
Thank you. Excellent questions. So I'm going to open that up to the panel. So I'll wait for them to eagerly raise their hands. And meanwhile, I'm going to signal to Steve that I'm going to get him to do a roundup, a summation at the end of this before we move on to the next bit. So that's your warning, Steve. Any of the panelists, would you like to respond? Please, Nick.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the question. On the first one, the culture of situational awareness, I mean, it's an interesting question as to why it arose in the US military. That would be an interesting anthropological question that we could ask, an historical question we could ask. Certainly in aviation, it wasn't there in every airline across the world if you went back 20, 25 years. So they were starting to develop cultures of situational awareness through a whole range of measures, training of crew primarily, to give them, and one of the big issues that was identified quite early on in aviation, there were two crews on an aircraft, and the second crew that was dealing with the passengers didn't feel it had a safety role. And there are good examples where failures could have been prevented because the crew in the back end of the aircraft did actually see things that the pilots needed to know. So that has led to, within that industry, a series of ways of training that brings groups like that together to really inculcate situational awareness. Much more difficult at the political level, I think, because you're trying to get across, uncertain risk. You're trying to get across how to deal with a very complicated situation. But equally, I mean, we've all got risk, not me personally, but both of our countries have got risk registers. And now and again, some of us are called in to ask or to consult on these. And so meetings are held to really appraise these issues. And I think that's one of the fora through which you can generate situational awareness. It doesn't necessarily answer the question of what happens. Again, it's Judy's point that there's knowledge on the ground, and you want to bring people who are involved actually in the day-to-day coalface of a risk issue to bear upon the situation. Much more difficult in a complex political institution, I think. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. And Kathy has asked to jump in with one important clarification. Please, Kathy.
Nick, very much appreciate that answer. The distinction I would draw to what operates in the United States Navy is situational authority, which presumes sound situational awareness, but actual authority to act as you see something.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Any other hands across the panel for the two questions, please? Okay, I thank you ever so much. I will move on to the second cluster of questions from Andrea Goldsmith, apologies for getting that wrong, and Julia Black. Andrea, please.
Thanks so much. It's really wonderful to have this conversation. And my question is related at a high level, and it's for all the panelists about international collaboration. So what mechanisms have you found work or are missing in your collaboration, both around research and then around crisis response. And this is somewhat related to Annalie's question about different countries are going to have different outcomes and different desires, yet the pandemic is global. And so we have an example, a recent one of a crisis that different countries responded to differently. In retrospect, should we have collaborated better? Was there other mechanisms? So both on the research front and on the crisis management front. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Julia, please. Julia Black.
Thank you. Fascinating discussion. Thank you so much to our panelists. So I have a question which I think builds on Andrea's point there, which is I work in the area of financial regulation. We learned a lot from the global financial crisis about resilience. But one of the things that is very, very apparent is that it costs a lot of money to prepare yourself for something that might not happen. And so one of the issues is, how do you get the economic capital from the capital markets and the political buy-in to actually have that redundancy in the system? So one of the things that we do is that we stress test, do scenario analysis, and we do stress testing, and we do reverse stress testing, which is how big does a crisis have to be to break the system. Now, that is, and you can do that globally. We do it nationally. We do some internationally. There are a couple of things that happen there. One is a behavioral. So you think your behavior is rational until you play it out and you see how everybody else has behaved, and you realize that actually your play is not going to work. The second reason, however, that we do this is partly to assure ourselves that the system is safe, but is also to demonstrate that redundant capacity is necessary. So it is a partly legitimizing in a closed session, wouldn't go out in public to say this, but it's partly a legitimizing device about capacity and redundancy in the system. So my question is, to what extent is that scenario analysis being done in any of these areas, either at a national or at a global level, or even just in different configurations of national and international collaboration? And what kind of role do you think it might have to the extent it's not already being done? Thank you.
Thank you ever so much. So I'm going to look to our panelists and see if I see any hands. And if I don't, I'm going to work my way across the screen. Okay. Thank you. Sarah, I see your hand up. Thank you.
I'm sending you a life preserver. On the international collaboration front, we see the research occurs organically, scientist to scientist, but there's also gaps and difficulties in finding the right people internationally to work with. And so we also, and particularly when this is happening in emerging critical areas, we find that we also have the engagements at the leadership level to be able to facilitate that. And it's something that needs, I do think it's something that we see that needs to be managed, because those relationships and that trust building that's created by that co-development of specific research areas, in particular critical research areas, is how we then manage through crises really effectively. An example I'll give of this is I was just recently down at the National Hurricane Center for NOAA, and they showed me a map around the world, and they have a map with a phone number and the cell phone number and of the key people in every country, where we also have our data from our satellites and our forecasts for hurricanes, so that if we see that something is emerging, or we might see something in some of our assets that we're worried they might not see, we can pick up the phone and call them and say, you need to start preparing for extreme rainfall event and evacuating your people to higher ground, or you need to prepare for storm surge and get people away from the coastline. And so having that long-term work that we've done with them has built that trust that when they get that phone call, that we are giving them something that they can also actually act upon. And so the management of those, where we know those areas are, where we might need to have that information, having those relationships in advance is critical. And then in the second one on stress test and reverse stress testing, and I'm increasingly seeing this for climate resilience discussions. Historically, it's all been about stress testing and scenario quantification. It's also a factor of how the science has developed, has led to that. But increasingly, we are, with the built environment, having these discussions about the reverse stress test, what breaks you. And I think that also opens up to the many factors of risk, particularly in the built environment that we have. For example, what might break a certain system might be climate change, but it also might be a failure in critical technology, it might be cybersecurity, it might be something else. And so when you also do that, you build the robustness to the many different types of threats that a built environment, critical piece of technology or infrastructure might be exposed to.
Thank you ever so much. I see Derek has his hand up.
Yes, I am addressing this idea of stress testing and reverse stress testing. In the public health sphere, we have the benefit of having pathogens cause outbreaks every year. And so an overlap between resources spent ostensibly in sort of preparing our systems for new pathogens and new pandemics, but delivering ongoing public health. But I do think there are opportunities in those responses to evaluate mechanisms of response that we don't really bring out in typical sort of day-to-day public health responses. And those responses are often sort of tied to the risks of, let's say, seasonal influenza, rather than testing strategies that we would engage if the risks were much greater. And I think this addresses the question of outcomes was a great question. And I think we need more empirical work on the public's evaluation of outcomes. And a population won't necessarily know how they'll evaluate and respond to different outcomes being evaluated, being the target of responses, without having had that experience of having gone through the different sort of disadvantages and advantages of those when presented with a real scenario. And so I think in the provision of public health and response to outbreaks that happen rather routinely, I think there can be more communication and more empirical studies to understand how the public values different outcomes.
Thank you ever so much. And then Judith, I see your hand is up.
It was a very similar point, actually, that was just pulling together the question about the very different outcomes that might be prioritized by different actors in the system and by different nations. And also the problem of how do you end up funding what looks like capacity that you might not need in a system. And one way of doing that, I guess, is better aligning both the business as usual issues of public health with the issues about, I'm thinking about pandemics here, with the issues of preparedness for emerging infections. And certainly in the example I took of Zambia, one of the issues was, and why I said it wasn't policy failure necessarily, is because, of course, a lot of that stuff that looked like it was ineffective at a national level had some co-benefits. It strengthened veterinary practice in the country and strengthened the kind of capacity of vets in the country. It strengthened some of the health service capacity that wasn't about, avian influenza might not have hit, but other things hit, and some of the laboratory capacity that was built is there for other things. So I think there's probably room for both meshing together what Derek was just talking about a better understanding of and sometimes there are trade-offs, there aren't co-benefits. You're trading one outcome against another, but at other times there are co-benefits, and kind of a better understanding of public, but also political and other actors in the system, and how they are doing those, and how you can kind of maximize in terms of justifying spend on the system resilience, how you kind of pull out the economic, particularly co-benefits of different kinds of resilience building.
Thank you. And really excellent examples shining throughout that response as well. So thank you so much. So I'm going to move over to our final question for the session before Steve drives us home with his amazing summary. Arati Prabhakar, would you like to come in with the final question, please?
Thank you, Brooke. Thank you, Steve, as well, for putting this amazing session together. And I thought our speakers were spectacular. I was particularly struck by the comments about learning. And we unfortunately, the kinds of catastrophes we've been talking about offer regular opportunities for learning. Infectious disease comes around regularly. You can always count on the flu, if nothing else. And unfortunately, climate disasters similarly keep coming at us. I would love to hear from the group any favorite example of a current example of Where we have learned and we are putting new institutional capacities in place that give you hope that we're going to do better the next time. Number one, what is working? And number two, what's your favorite example of something that you think we must be doing, but we are not yet doing?
Thank you. An excellent challenge to end our discussion with. So does anyone want to go first? Judith?
It's a great question. I can't think that quickly. I'm scanning. Someone else.
It's okay. Go on, I'll jump in.
Oh, thank you, Nick.
All right. Well, the learning thing is a colleague of mine, Bill Freudenberg, who was at Santa Barbara, sadly passed away a few years ago, talked about the atrophy of vigilance, by which he meant that over time we do actually forget the lessons we really ought to have learned from the past. So that's something always to look out for. The example I'd give, again, it's a technical example, but it would apply to all of these domains. We worked with a major airline a few years ago, and they were struggling in looking at in trying to learn from their incident reports. And they couldn't actually use the formal risk and uncertainty matrix that they'd been given by the aviation authorities to calculate risk in aviation. Because by definition, a high frequency, high catastrophic event just doesn't happen. So parts of the matrix are not usable in aviation at all. And a bit of anthropology with them worked out what the assessors were doing, who were doing a very good job. They were learning by looking at the number of safety barriers that have been breached by an incident. And the moment they had a lot of safety barriers breached, they would immediately click into this very mindful, trying to work out exactly what had gone wrong in this particular incident. And then they clearly used digital and other techniques to generate a stock of internal understandings of the key things that were going wrong, potentially or not, in the airline, and keeping things safe through doing that, so that you can put in place internal systems which surveil and learn. But the question I think I posed right at the end with the work by Jean Lecoz and his challenge to us all, I think, and I don't think anybody has an answer to it, that why are we seeing failures that we've seen before? And is it because there's something in the organizational and the system that's producing artifacts for us that has changed and that has allowed us to forget the atrophy of vigilance to come in? And I think that's a serious research question. I don't think it's one we can answer here today. On the natural hazards and some of the pandemic issues, I think there'll be lots of examples where we could put in learning systems that look back. And one of the challenges of and I know I sat on a couple of the science advisory groups in the UK, and one of the challenges, the first challenges over the first 6 months, almost to a year, was to try and unravel what we knew from the past and what was good quality information and what was bad quality information. And that's probably a challenge for those of you in infectious disease or in climate change, to say, well, in advance of things going wrong, where's the best quality information found? Because there was a lot out there and it wasn't all information we could use for learning. So working out our information sources and where good quality information is important to this as well. Thank you. That was a bit of a long answer, but there you go.
An incredibly insightful answer. So thank you ever so much. So looking across our panel, would anyone like to go next? No. Okay. So may I come over to Sarah, please?
Okay. So the first, I would say, I think something I've done really well is people are starting to be aware of heat, both in the United States and the UK, because we've had this series of large heat waves in both countries, especially in places that do not have access to air conditioning or heat plants. So they've never experienced a heat wave before. And so there has been a large response. I can speak to the US, what we've done in creating NIHIS, National Institute for Heat Health Information System, which has NOAA, but it also has the Center for Disease Control, Environmental Prediction, Department of Defense, Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, Veteran Affairs, because they are very, very vulnerable, and the list goes on. Because there's an importance on our understanding of the threats that we are going to see to co-develop the science that's needed, the communication strategies to create adaptation resilience, and also the public communication strategies. So people get, like, if we produce all this great science and no one is using it, then it doesn't have its full value. And so we need to make sure that it's being taken up and used and leading to the outcomes that we want. So I think we're seeing some really good work on heat, and in the United States, heat is the largest killer in terms of weather climate extremes. Number two, on the question of what is needed, I think we're going to see increased need for such coordination on resilience, but also the tricky problems of what type of resilience do we want, what type of world do we need, and what is our appetite for risk or an exposure? And those are really hard questions that I don't think we necessarily have the answers to, as we're also dealing with these rapid changes. The default is to just increase our vulnerabilities to these things without any action.
Excellent, thank you. And really looking at the challenges of the future's work that is that we're still struggling with and trying to do. So thank you ever so much. Derek, I'm going to move over to you and then to Judith to close this section off, and Steve will summarize, please. So Derek, please.
Yeah, definitely. I think there are many triumphs in this most recent pandemic in the rapidity with which vaccines and therapeutics were produced, and a lot of that wasn't just sort of scientific, biomedical cellular level innovation, but was really sort of building regulatory and scientific frameworks to evaluate interventions, and sort of doing that very rapidly. I think that one thing that I think needs to be scaled up in the future is better sort of scientific advance, logistical, better frameworks for surveillance to go to that next level of understanding systemic interventions. Because I really think that we still sort of, looking back at the pandemic, certainly in the United States, thinking about sort of within the country variability and the experience in the pandemic, really what drives how we think we did was how well we measured it. And many places measured what happened very poorly and thus could think that we did very well. And I think to scale up to that next level of understanding systemic interventions and how different societies even have responded to pandemic threats and understanding how well they work will need sort of innovation and the evaluation framework and surveillance frameworks to figure out what happened.
Excellent. Thank you ever so much, and an excellent challenge for us to rise to. Judith, would you like to share your reflections, please?
Yeah, sure. And this may not be at quite the same kind of scale, but one of the things that worked well in terms of UK response to pandemics was probably the implementation and rollout of the vaccine programme, which did kind of combine quite a high level of health system response, as well as mobilising quite a significant public response in terms of the number of volunteers who volunteered their time to help at vaccine centres and so on. And I think that's kind of when you get, it was a nice example of when communication kind of hit the right level of evoking commonality between publics and trust. And that's the one thing maybe we picked up less than I thought we would, although all the speakers touched on it a little bit, of one of the challenges of communicating not just uncertainty, but communicating any kind of knowledge, any kind of preparedness, is what some have called a declining trust in expertise generally, and maybe a declining trust in political actors as well. So there is something that's perhaps the biggest challenge that would be on my list, is what we do to repair or foster or kind of make trust a bit more resilient. It's not just about the kind of science of communication, it's also around the how one manages that with the threats that there are to trust in trust in scientific communication.
Oh, thank you so much. And I feel like we start so much of this with trust, and we're also ending with trust being a theme cutting through. So thank you ever so much. So I just wanted to take this opportunity before I move over to Steve for a quick summation to thank Derek, Judith, Sarah, and Nick for engaging with this, for sharing your thoughts and views, and for helping us to create such an informative discussion. So thank you so much for taking part in that. And Steve, I'm going to hand over to you to drive us home, and then hand over to the next section of the session.
Thank you. So it's probably not a surprise to anyone that all four speakers emphasized the fact that we're not going to be able to solve these problems that have been dominated by discourse on technical and scientific technical and scientific approaches without understanding the human dimensions and bringing in more information from the social sciences. Derek talked about the need to build human trust when you're combating dengue in Brazil. Judith's entire presentation was about information that is known, that could have been used to make much better decisions, and that wasn't somehow incorporated because our institutions aren't built to incorporate it. Examples came, for instance, from avian flu in Zaire, I believe it was. Sarah talked about the need for community level engagement to be able to prepare communities to use the information that her agency delivers. And Nick emphasized that it's as correct to say that production pressures caused the Challenger accident as much as it's correct to say that the failure of a seal caused the Challenger accident. The problem is, what to do about it when you've got problems of global scale. The one recipe that came through repeatedly, and including in Arthi's question, is that we need more information and more timely information about these ongoing threats at a global scale, because we don't know enough and we are going to be surprised. All right. And so we need situational awareness, all right, if we're going to use the aircraft carrier lingo, even if we don't have situational authority, all right? It's 1 for 2 is better than nothing. And so Derek showed that in his serological screening that showed Zika epidemics that had been, that were otherwise undetectable until at least birth defects sadly occurred. Sarah talked about this at some length, right? And Nick talked about it too in his description of the need for adaptability to prevent lock-in to begin with. So I found all this to be really fascinating, and particularly the discussion of situational awareness, situational authority, and adaptability, although I'm not sure how to translate that into any global institutions. I don't know where you would get the kind of situational authority you need in a global institution, right? I want to put my thumb on the scales of one topic that wasn't mentioned much in the discussion, and that was Sarah's description and cataloging of compound events, because I think this might actually provide a way forward for trying to bring together information on the science and technical side and from the social sciences. She showed compound events that are already occurring that include epidemics and also include climatic events. And, there's a lot of science that could be done here now. We could begin to estimate probabilities of these sorts of things. We could begin to do a lot more scenario planning and perhaps build the capacity to estimate, analyze, and prepare for better than we have today. So compound events is a phrase I'd like to leave in your heads. And with that said, my summary, such as it is over.
That was a beautiful summary. You covered so much ground with that. And I think that leaves it to me now to introduce our co-leads of the PCAST and CST joint committee involved in organizing today's meeting. So we've had a lot of collaboration and work behind the scenes. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to John Levin, Vicky Sato of PCAST, and Jim Hall of CST.
Okay, great. Well, I'm John Levin, a member of PCAST, and I'd like to first just, first thank the panelists for those insightful and thought-provoking remarks and discussion. Thank our moderator, Steve Pacala, for that wonderful summary, and Brooke for that warm but firm moderation. And also the members of PCAST and CST who helped to organize this meeting. So that's Steve Pacala, Kathy Witecki, and John DeBeery from PCAST, along with Vicky Sato, my co-chair for this, and Brooke Rogers, Muffy Calder, Fiona Murray, Nick Stern, and Paul Stein from CST. Thank you all for your work in putting this together. Now, at the conclusion of this public meeting, PCAST and CST will release a joint statement addressed to President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Rishi Sunak that will outline some of our shared views about priority issues for science and technology and areas for future collaboration between both councils and between the countries. And that statement will be posted on the PCAST and CST websites. I'll turn it over to Jim Hall.
Thank you very much indeed, John. And just to conclude, let me, as well as thanking everyone for their contribution, really kind of highlight how this afternoon's meeting and indeed the preparation for it has underlined the shared interests and opportunities for collaboration between these two councils. And yet the interactions between our councils are, of course, just the tip of the iceberg of scientific and technological interaction between the USA and the UK, which we really endorse and encourage. As the joint statement, which, as you've heard, will shortly be released, will say, PCAST and CST are utterly committed to the importance of scientific evidence in addressing these challenges and to the opportunities which technology bring to addressing them. We've got a lot to learn. We've heard that from this afternoon, but this afternoon, I think, has also been quite an optimistic session in the sense that we've recognized the ways in which scientific advance will expand the realms of human knowledge to all of our benefit. And also how responsible innovation will help us to address some of these really critical challenges that we face and we've heard about this afternoon. So will help us to improve our human well-being and work towards greater prosperity. And with that, I will hand over to John Brown.
Jim, thank you very much. So first, let me say thank you very much on behalf of CST for the discussion. It was really wide-ranging and insightful, and I think it did demonstrate that the whole, without any doubt, is greater than the sum of the parts. So thank you for that. I was just reflecting on what I would take away from this, and perhaps what others would take away, rather slightly more what we can do today, something a little bit more practical. And I would just pick four very simple things. First, it seems to me we really have to focus on fairness here. This is not just about us, it's about the world. And it's very important to incorporate the global South with the global North, in particular with adaptation, as Sarah pointed out. I'm sure that can be done through finance, but there's a lot to do in that area. Secondly, it seems to me that we are learning that large-scale responses, the implementation of large-scale response, does require a real deep understanding of local consequences, otherwise simply doesn't work. Thirdly, we do have to engage and communicate these risks far better than we've done in the past, with a real balanced view. And it's getting that balance right that is so difficult when there are so many different voices associated. And finally, we have to continue to work on permanent learning of lessons from the past. In my own experience, I find that it takes far less than a generation. Perhaps it only takes 2 years to forget the lessons and reinvent them. It would be really good if we didn't have to do that. So thank you very much, and over to Maria.
Okay, thank you all. So on behalf of PCAST, let me again thank the speakers for their very insightful presentations, and thank everybody here for the great conversation. This session really highlights the kind of very real challenges that are facing our countries and the world. And if we all remember the fact that the leaders of our countries asked us to get together because they see these challenges and realize how important science and technology are in solving them. And I will end with the fact that clearly we're going to be better off in facing these challenges together than separately. So let me thank the PCAST CST Joint Committee for organizing such a rich session and for drafting the statement. I thank the CST members for an excellent meeting and for traveling across the pond here to DC to join PCAST in person. To the general public, I will tell you that the recording of this meeting and the associated slide presentations will be available on the PCAST website next week. And finally, I will hereby adjourn the public session. Thank you all for joining us.